All right, so as the handout goes around, I just want to thank the School of Nursing students for inviting me to give this talk today. And hopefully it does supplement what it is that you learn here at Johns Hopkins University. I'm really excited to have this conversation. It's a conversation that's very important given the April 27th uprising that we've had here in the city. When we think about what has happened here in Baltimore, the question is, where do we go from here? And how do we heal from the scars that are with us today? So the name of my talk, and I hope everyone has a copy of the model of historical trauma so that you can more easily follow along. And just in case you don't get a chance to shake my hand or vice versa afterwards, you can reach me on Twitter at bmoredoc or at lawrence.brown@morgan.edu. You can write that down just in case we're not able to touch bases after the talk. So when we think about health outcomes here in Baltimore City, we see, as Ellie mentioned, a tremendous amount of disparities. And if we look at health outcomes in Roland Park, Upton, Guilford, and Sandtown, Winchester, you can see that that becomes readily apparent here. A person that lives in Roland Park has a life expectancy of 84.1 years, while a person that lives in the Upton community has a life expectancy of 62.9 years, and that's a 21 to 22 year difference. How can that be in a city where neighborhoods are less than 5 miles apart? How do we have these vast differences in life expectancy? You also see the life expectancy in Sandtown, Winchester, which is the neighborhood where Freddie Gray lived, is 65.3 years. And many of the demographic data fall out as we've sort of been, as I'm sure many of you kind of know. It seems that in predominantly black neighborhoods, there are worse indicators, and in predominantly white neighborhoods, there are much better indicators. And so here's sort of a life expectancy map for the city of Baltimore. And the question is, how many years can a newborn baby expect to live in Baltimore City? Again, when we look at certain neighborhoods, especially surrounding downtown and the midtown area, we see that babies that live in the red neighborhoods don't expect to live long. And this must be hopefully a tremendous concern for you in the School of Nursing, and I've told folks from the School of Medicine and Public Health as well. This has to be a real concern. How can we equalize and create equity in our communities here in Baltimore City? So what I want to share with you, and you have this in front of you, is a bit of an explanation in terms of how we got to where we are in Baltimore City today. And this is a model of historical trauma that's presented by Michelle Sotero in her article by the same name, A Conceptual Model of Historical Trauma. And her model posits that historical trauma originates with the subjugation of a population by a dominant group. Successful subjugation requires at least 4 elements: overwhelming physical and psychological violence, segregation and or displacement, economic deprivation or destruction, and cultural dispossession. And so any group, any vulnerable group that experiences these 4 elements can be said to have experienced a mass trauma experience. And in experiencing that, will have tremendous health implications, not only for the generation that experiences the initial trauma, but for the generations that come to follow through the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And so her theories, basically she says that a key feature of historical trauma theory is that The psychological and emotional consequences of the trauma experience are subsequently transmitted through generations, through physiological, environmental, and social pathways, resulting in an intergenerational cycle of trauma response. Now, how many of you have heard of historical trauma? Okay, about half of you. All right, so thankfully we're not totally breaking new ground here today. So I want to share with you a bit about the African American experience historically, and I want you to see if these four elements do indeed apply to African Americans in the United States more broadly, but in Baltimore as we sort of hone in. But we'll start with the national outlook of physical and psychological violence. And so really, in order to understand that, we have to think about, and this is all post-1865, so post-emancipation. You can imagine all of the violence that happened before this point, but I want to focus on what happens afterwards. So we start with the violent overthrow of Reconstruction. Then we have, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, a report that they came out with earlier this year, 3,959 lynchings between 1877 and 1950 in 12 southern states. That's nearly 4,000 lynchings in the United States of African Americans. And those are only in 12 southern states, so if we include other states, I'm sure we would get over 4,000 for that figure. Then we have what a scholar, Liam Hogan, calls he calls it collective punishment. I call it white supremacist collective punishment. And he has a map I'll show you in a bit, detailing incidents between 1824 and 1974. And then there are also sundown towns. So let's start with the violent overthrow of Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan, White Knights, and other groups fought Reconstruction in the South between 1865 and 1877, using violence, assassinations, stealing the franchise, and establishing poll taxes. And this is all found in a wonderful, powerful book by Douglas Egerton called The Wars of Reconstruction, The Brief Violent History of America's Most Progressive Era. And here he describes a whole litany of how this was actually America's most progressive period. And by the way, you might be wondering, he's going into a lot of history for a health talk, but you'll see why as we move forward. And so African Americans actually were well represented in Congress, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. At the time, even had a black governor, PBS Pinchback of Louisiana. This was a time of tremendous progress, and this was for the freedmen and women who had just been enslaved. They bursted out of enslavement, becoming franchised and becoming citizens and leaders in the United States. A powerful moment, but as we sort of know in American history, whenever someone in the black community says, yes, we can, oftentimes there's a backlash saying, no, you can't. And so this is what happens during Reconstruction. And it was so bad that in 1871, President Ulysses Grant basically signed the Ku Klux Klan Act in order to help defeat white supremacist terrorism in the South. And this was the original incarnation of the Klan, Klan 1.0 as I call it, that had originated, as the Klan sort of rises again a couple of times in American history. But in Klan 1.0, this was a real issue. And in 1877, unfortunately, if you know your history, the federal troops are withdrawn from the South. Anybody know what precipitates that? There's an election that takes place. Who becomes president? Oh yeah, this is nursing. All right, well, that's all right. We'll learn a little bit today. President Rutherford B. Hayes. And the compromise of 1876, he becomes president. They say, well, Rutherford, we'll let you be president, but you're going to have to withdraw those federal troops from the South. And that was the compromise. So when the federal troops are withdrawn from the South, it's an open reign, open season on black people. The Confederate soldiers, the neo-Confederates who wanted things to go back to the way they were, really sort of clamped down in a reign of terror all across the South. And this didn't happen all at once, but it did happen so that by 1900, the toll was complete. Now here's a map of racial terror lynchings across the South that I mentioned earlier, 3,959 between 1877 and 1950. And it's not like they ended after this time period. As a matter of fact, in my home county of Crittenden County, Arkansas, in 1954, a black man named Isidore Banks was lynched. And lynch is a very sort of, word that you can use to describe many things, but to say more specifically, he was actually kidnapped. His body was found burned, charred, castrated, and he was tied to a tree when they found him. He was barely recognizable. I think they only found him by his dental records. And so now he was a landowner who owned hundreds of acres. Mysteriously, after he died, of course, that land ended up in the hands of some wealthy plutocrats in the county and hasn't been returned since. So that was 1954, actually 2 weeks after Brown versus Board of Education was handed down by the Supreme Court. And so there's this history of racial terror enacted against black people here in the United States. And here's the map I was mentioning by a researcher named Liam Hogan, who's actually in Ireland, and he calls it collective punishment, mob violence, pogroms, coups d'etats. One example is Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. There was actually a biracial government there, and white folks got on the radio and they started saying, oh, we need to get rid of this biracial government, and whipped up a mob, and the mob chased out the black leadership, killed many people in the black community, resulting in a mass exodus of 2,100 black residents. And this happened all across the country. Atlanta in 1906, Springfield, Illinois, 1908, East St. Louis, a labor riot in 1917 where black workers were breaking a strike by white workers and violence ensued there. The Red Summer of 1919, we're almost 100 years after that now, over 25 race riots is what they were called, happened around the country, including in DC, Baltimore, Chicago, Omaha, and other places. In 1921, maybe some of you have heard of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood black community there was destroyed by an angry, really terrible mob there that killed more than 200 black residents, leaving 10,000 black people homeless. And so these incidents of violence are called collective punishments because it wasn't just like a lynching where maybe one or two people were killed, but an entire community was wiped out. An entire community was wiped out. Now, what did that mean for a community to be wiped out? We're talking about businesses, we're talking about churches, we're talking about schools, we're talking about the collective economic and social potential of a people that are being wiped out anytime these sort of incidents happen in the United States. And so this is only a list of maybe 7 or 8 of those, but as you can see in this map here, there are close to 100 of these incidents that happen in the United States. Atrocities would be a better word. Well, scholar James Lowen, he talks about sundown towns, and how many of you have ever heard of sundown towns? Well, that's very interesting because sundown towns were very prominent here in the United States. There were cities that are towns, often smaller, where black people had to leave by sundown or face violence. And there are hundreds of these towns that he catalogs in his book. This is the author of another book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. So he writes about these towns, and there's a town in Illinois called Anna, A-N-N-A, and it's called Ain't No N-Word Allowed. So it was what the acronym of that city stood for in terms of sundown town. So in terms of how this history of violence helps explain why black people leave the South, why black people leave the South in droves between 1910 and 1970. In this map, between 1916 and 1930. But you can see the routes that black people take because in the early 1900s, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Well, after enslavement, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. And so it wasn't just a matter of saying, let's go search for opportunities in terms of the Great Migration. It was also, let's get up out of here. Let's get away from the racial terror. Let's get away from the race rioting, the lynchings. Let's get away from that. And so 6.5 million black people leave the South. The largest demographic internal revolution in the United States history between 1910 and 1970, arriving in cities like Baltimore, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. And so at the beginning of this period, we find mass segregation and housing market discrimination. And we have these policies and practices of segregation: racial zoning, racially restrictive covenants, redlining, real estate conspiracy, segregated public housing, and segregated medical care and public health. So congratulations, everyone. You are actually in the hometown where racial zoning originated in 1910. December 20th, on December 20th of this year, we will be 105 years. We'll be celebrating the anniversary of racial zoning, Baltimore being the first city in the United States to pass a comprehensive racial zoning law in the United States. And so Garrett Power, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Maryland School of Law, he wrote, many progressives agreed that poor blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, number one, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into nearby white neighborhoods, number two, and to protect property values among the white majority. So here we actually see the three main rationale of segregation. Number one, to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance. What civil disturbances? The types of civil disturbances: race riots, pogroms, coups d'etats that I just got through talking about, right? And so number two, to prevent the spread of communicable disease. Now, what disease was spreading rapidly at that time that would have been a cause of concern for people living in Baltimore City? Say it again. TB, right, tuberculosis, rapidly spreading communicable disease that just so happens to spread in unsanitary conditions, right? So the solution for tuberculosis, get this, was to place African Americans in slums that were very unsanitary, right? And what do you think that did in terms of helping the spread of disease in Baltimore at the time, right? And so number three, to protect property values among the white majority. Again, it's as if blackness has some sort of magical property to just reduce property values just by its mere presence. That was the notion. So in order to protect property values in white neighborhoods, have to keep black people out. Now, fortunately, this was struck down by the Supreme Court in Buchanan versus Worley in 1917, but it is not as though the Supreme Court was doing a matter of social justice. It was merely saying that there was a white homeowner that wanted to sell his own home to a black home buyer, and the Supreme Court said, well, we don't want to discriminate against, we don't want to keep a white homeowner from being able to sell his home to whoever he wishes. So that was this was in no way the Supreme Court saying, let's get rid of racial segregation. And so here's the New York Times in 1910, December 25th, Christmas Day. There's Baltimore Mayor J. Barry Mahul in the middle, who signs the first racial zoning law in the United States. There's African-American lawyer George McMeekin, who moved into the home on 1834 McCullough Street, West Baltimore, not too far from where Freddie Gray lived in Santown, Winchester. And so this tremendous article actually tells the story almost 105 years ago. So Supreme Court strikes it down, but wait, there's another tool that comes online called racially restrictive covenants. And it was actually pioneered, congratulations once again, right here in Baltimore City. You are in the home of racial segregation. And it was created by a man named Edward Boughton of the Roland Park Company, and the Roland Park Company developed Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, and the original Northwood communities in the years that you see listed there. Now, originally these communities before 1918 were part of the suburbs because this land didn't belong to the city. But in 1918, the merger or annexation happens, and these communities actually become a part of the city. So when they do, they already had racially restrictive covenants, and so then they become a part of the landscape of segregation in Baltimore City. And so Edward Boughton is the pioneer of this racially restrictive tool, and it was also used in other communities in Baltimore, like Ashburton and Forest Park. Now, fortunately, this was struck down by the Supreme Court, 1948, Shelley versus Kramer, which is great, but wait, there's more. There's also a real estate conspiracy, and we see Mayor James Preston, who takes over after Mayor J. Barry Mahul. He sought to sort of keep residential segregation in place, and so he says, I'm going to go to Chicago. Let me learn about how they're doing it there, and I'm going to bring back some ideas here, and we're going to keep it going. And so he utilized a public-private conspiracy to maintain segregation after Buchanan versus Worley. But following him was Mayor Howard Jackson, and he formed actually a committee for segregation. He said, hey, you, and you, I want you on my committee for segregation. We're going to help keep segregation alive in the United States, here in Baltimore City. And so Garrett Power, again, in a different paper, says, this committee encouraged neighbors, government officials, and real estate agents to use restrictive covenants, that tool we mentioned just a moment ago, peer pressure, harassment, and suasion to promote de facto segregation. Now, in fact, it wasn't de facto, it was actually the law. It was actually still a part of the law. Anybody ever seen this sort of color scheme before? Know what it means, right? It was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which later became the Federal Housing Administration. And the Federal Housing Administration basically created a scheme that we now know as redlining. And it's a color-coded scheme, green, red, yellow, and red. And basically, if you read Antero Patel's, anybody ever heard of his book, Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped the Great American City? He talks about how eugenics, the pseudoscience of eugenics, which actually was, I believe, taught here at Hopkins, unfortunately, back then. But this pseudoscience, racial science of eugenics, was the basis of the redlining map. Now, actually, it wasn't called redlining map, it was called a residential security map. Think about that, residential security map. Residential security from what? Residential security from who? And so this was a part, of course, African Americans lived here, maybe recently arrived, not quite yet white immigrants, lived in yellow neighborhoods, Irish, Polish, Russian folk, not quite white yet, Italians. And then in these neighborhoods, Protestant whites in blue and green. And maybe the difference there would have been the condition of the homes. Newer homes would have been green, well-kept neighborhoods, maybe like Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, original Northwood would have been in the green. Slightly older, not as well kept up, but still great, and 100% white would have been blue. And so, fortunately, this was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1968 in Jones versus Mayer, and also in the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And here's the residential security map for Baltimore City. Maybe you can't read it, but that's where it says residential security map.
What year is that from?
1937. And you remember that map I showed you earlier about the life expectancy? Anybody see a pattern or a correlation? Not too dissimilar. Well, 1937 was a great year for segregation because not only did it witness the birth of redlining, but also segregated public housing. 1937, Mayor Howard Jackson, in his second term, creates the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, and they create segregated public housing with 5 different public housing units. At that time, white people lived in public housing. They lived in Perkins homes and Latrobe homes, and black folk lived in McCullough, Douglas, and Poe. Not Poe as in poor, but Edgar Allan Poe. All right. So there's McCullough homes over there, or 2 of the towers there in the high rises. And it was actually shown in Thompson versus HUD in the 90s and into the 2000s, a lawsuit that residents filed that showed that the areas outside of Baltimore City, if they had low-income black folk that needed housing, they said, where shall we send you? Are we going to send you to public housing that we have here? No, we're going to send you to Baltimore City, thereby concentrating, increasing the concentration of impoverished, low-income black folk in Baltimore City. So there was also segregated public health at the time. Druid Heights, I believe, Health Center was for the black community, whereas the other health districts were white. So you had segregation in public health. Johns Hopkins and other hospitals at the time were segregated. Johns Hopkins was segregated, I believe, up until 1971. But what's the health impact of segregation? That's what we want to know, right? And so in a paper published by folks right here at Hopkins, Thomas Levis, you may know him, and his colleagues, they wrote that racial segregation creates different exposures to economic opportunity and to other community resources that enhance health. Likewise, segregation produces differential exposure to health risk. So basically what we're saying is that segregation decreases exposure to community resources that enhance health, while at the same time increasing exposure to health risk. Do you all see that? Right, so this has a powerful, it's not just, oh, let's create a situation where one community lives apart from another community. These policies, and practices have a material and bodily impact on the lives of people living in these communities. If you live in Sandtown, Winchester, your chance for being lead poisoned are really, really high. And if you know anything about lead poisoning, you would say, well, why aren't we abating lead in a mass lead abatement campaign? Isn't that our education? That's our education, because lead impairs cognitive development. It contributes greatly to our crime because lead basically interferes with the ability to control your emotional impulse. So it's contributing to our education problem, it's contributing to our crime problem, but yet we still have thousands of children in Baltimore City that are living in homes that have not had lead abatement. Why? Why is that? Why do we allow that in the greatest country in the world? And so this is what happens, but this is what happens with segregation. This is what happens with segregation. So I mentioned this earlier, this is also a part of the picture. So segregation, those are policies and practices there. Now I want to shift gears and talk about serial forced displacement. This is usually very much hardly ever discussed. So we're talking about policies and practices here again: slum clearance, urban renewal, highway construction, / black neighborhood destruction. I'm sorry guys, Johns Hopkins led eminent domain. I'm going to touch on that. And then the demolition of black cultural institutions. So slum clearance, let's start there. We actually know the numbers. 2,733 homes were demolished to make way for those 5 public housing developments that I discussed earlier. And out of that number, 1,863 were black families. Families that were displaced. 68% of that population displaced were black. And because they were segregated, only McCullough, Poe, right? McCullough, Poe, and Douglas were allotted for black tenants. So that meant that only 1,125 of the newly created public housing units were for black families. 1,125. So let's do the math. If you have 1,863 families that you're displacing, but you only create 1,125 units of public housing, what does that mean? What happened? What did we just do to the housing market? Should I do a little dance? Jeopardy, do. Huh? What? We made 700 people homeless. We have disrupted and disturbed the housing market. A net loss of 700 homes. Now, I'm sure some of you have maybe taken economics, perhaps in college, perhaps in high school. Now, if you decrease the supply of housing and you wipe them out from the housing market, what happens to the rent in the remaining houses on the market? It goes up, right? So what does this mean? Segregation, forced displacement in this instance, actually results in people paying more for housing. In black people paying more for housing that they would not have to pay otherwise, all of because of the disruption and the disturbance and the demolition of homes in the housing market, right? Then there's urban renewal. Our good friend, Mayor Thomas D'Alessandro Jr., helps carry this out in Baltimore City. First authorized in the 1949 Housing Act, but then also strengthened in the 1954 Housing Act. And it basically empowered universities, hospitals, places like these to basically engage in large-scale urban renewal, which James Baldwin, a black writer at the time, called Negro removal. And it was so devastating, so powerful, that it displaced 8,091 families here in Baltimore City. 8,000. Can you imagine that number? And we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about families. Families. Oh boy.
Don't apologize.
Oh, well, okay, they told me not to apologize. So there's a campus expansion that Hopkins engages in to create room for the professors and students. In 1956, well, they started a little bit before then, but by 1956, they're moving along, and here's our good friend, Mayor Thomas D'Alessandro Jr., who helps carry this out. You can see him breaking the ground. 1956, and it displaced 855 black families. 855 black families in the Broadway redevelopment project. Oh my, who is this? History repeats itself in the 2000s, y'all. Our good friend, former mayor, then governor, and aspiring presidential candidate. We're not gonna say how great his odds are. We're just gonna say that he's running, right? Announced the East Baltimore Development Incorporated. 3 of the 5 signatories come from Hopkins institutions, 3 out of 5. You tell me what happens when you have 3 out of 5. What type of project it is, whose project that is, who's running it, who's controlling it. It displaced 742 black families in the Middle East community. Using the power of eminent domain, which is upheld by the Supreme Court in 2005 in Kelo versus New London. Unlike segregation, which is generally sort of struck down by the Supreme Court, serial forced displacement is given new power, new life. Now, instead of displacing people for public interest, Kelo versus New London says we can do it for private interest. We don't have to build a highway, we don't have to build a library. We can just, if a corporation wants to take somebody's land and the government agrees, we say that it's all right. Kelo versus New London. Now here's an aerial view of Baltimore in 1959. Here's an aerial view of Baltimore in 2010. Anybody notice any difference? What's going on? What do y'all see here? What changes?
Trees.
Highways, trees. All right. What highway is this? Anybody know what this is? Say it again. That's 83, right? Somebody's riding 83. All right. What's this right here? US 40. AKA the highway to nowhere. They never completed it because budgetary costs and because there was mass resistance. Activists got together and said, we don't want this neighborhood coming through our communities, which it would have through downtown. The upper end, I believe, of Federal Hill, Inner Harbor, would have tore right through Baltimore neighborhoods. But it did tear through this neighborhood, which was predominantly black, well, actually majority black because it was segregated, so we can say 100% black, and it displaced 960 black families. This is our last Republican governor who was governor, not governor, but he was our last Republican mayor, Mayor Theodore McKeldin, who was mayor during this time. There's also something else you notice if you look at this map. Compare the density here with what you see here? What changes? Oh, y'all whispering now. Come on, speak to me. What you say? Ah, that's right. And I didn't notice this until a couple days ago. Like, these are homes. A lot of these are homes. And you can see now as businesses, the density is much less. There's much less density. So there were people there that were displaced too. As a matter of fact, the Charles Center, which is roughly here, that was an urban renewal project. So we can get a sense of how the landscape changes by looking at this map. Now, who knows what road this is right here? MLK. MLK. Nonviolence, nonviolence. Our brother who wanted desegregation. But look at the road. Look at what this does. It splits West Baltimore from, it does it better than what was the case before. There was nothing there. I mean, there were a few roads, but look at how strikingly this road is able to separate and segregate and intensify the segregation in Baltimore City. The irony that a road named after Brother Dr. Martin Luther King is used to help intensify segregation in Baltimore City. Now, this is a highway in Chicago, 14 lanes. Look at how powerfully that highway is able to, see, you get a 2-for-1 with highways, y'all. You can both displace and segregate with highways, right? So, I mean, look at this. Public housing on one side, residential on the other, completely separated. So let's think about this. When we talk about health, usually we talk about individuals, don't we? Usually we think about patients, clients. We think about people that we serve. We think about when we see them in our different practices, hospitals, what do we want to do? We want to know their history, don't we? We want to know their background. How did your back start hurting? What happened to your tooth? When did the pain start? But we never ask that about our communities. We never ask those questions. How did our communities become the way that they are? And so when we add up all the numbers between 15,000 and 20,000 black families in Baltimore have been forced to relocate. Black communities have been torn apart, uprooted, pushed out, displaced, built a road over, torn apart, and suffering from disinvestment, because if somebody announces they're going to build a highway directly through the middle of your community, even if they don't take your home, what are you going to do if you're one of the remaining ones and you're maybe 2 blocks away from the highway? Some people never fix it up because they're thinking, well, maybe they may come and buy my home, so why fix it up? Right? So it begins a pattern of disinvestment. After so many people are uprooted, people say, well, Miss Mary, she doesn't live here anymore. Maybe I'll leave too. So it creates a cycle of vacant homes that become a big problem in this part of town. Now, what are the health effects of serial forced displacement? So in her book, Root Shock, Mindy Fullilove, psychiatrist at Columbia University, says root shock is the traumatic stress reaction to the destruction of all or part of one's emotional system. Now check this out. Buildings, neighborhoods, cities, nations are not simply bricks and mortar that provide us shelter. Because we dance in a ballroom, have a parade in the street, make love in a bedroom, and prepare a feast in the kitchen. Each of these places becomes imbued with sounds, smells, noises, and feelings of those moments and how we live them. We're ecological beings. We're social, we're ecological beings. Anybody remember the high school that you went to? The place where you first had your first kiss? I mean, talk to me. Do you remember? We don't have to be shy. Do you remember the place where you went to worship? And imagine if you were to go there right now and it was demolished, it was obliterated. How would you feel? How would you, no, high school, maybe, some people mistreated you. Everybody maybe wasn't popular in here, like I'm sure most of you were. But, once you get past those feelings, imagine if your high school was destroyed. And you just walk back and like, it's gone. Where'd it go? It used to be right here. Imagine you were a little bit older, because everybody looks so young in here, so fresh. Imagine you had grandkids and you want to show them the place where you had your first kiss, the place where you went to high school, the place where you had your prom, and it's gone, it's wiped out. How would you feel? How would you be able to pass on the legacy the history, the culture? And that's a part of what was wiped out in black neighborhoods. Jazz clubs, juke joints, churches, places where people congregated, the music, the art. All the cultural institutions, many of these destroyed and wiped out because this just didn't take place in Baltimore City. It happened in 900 municipalities across the United States. So serial forced displacement leads to this feeling that one's emotional ecosystem has been destroyed. Now I apologize with the conversion from Mac to PC. There's a bit of an issue there, but when we look at the impacts of this, and I call it American apartheid, we see that there's wealth extraction because you're buying more, it takes more to buy a home because you don't have access to those FHA housing loans or the housing mortgages that are insured by the FHA. Now you have to spend more on contracts. If you've ever read Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Case for Reparation, he talks about Clyde Woods spending more on the home, right? Contract buying. We talked about the wealth that's lost with serial forced displacement, businesses lost, churches lost, schools lost, cultural institutions lost, homes lost, so wealth lost there. Results in root shock for serial forced displacement, results in disinvestment for segregation, results in the hardening of anti-black stereotypes and racial bias. Because suburbs because the FHA gave out these racially discriminatory mortgages, or basically insured mortgages in a racially discriminatory manner, suburbs became disproportionately white, almost exclusively white. Matter of fact, James Lowe in his book talks about sundown suburbs. And so imagine what it means if you were, say, a police officer who grew up in the suburbs and you're policing in Baltimore City. Our statistics show that 80 to 90% of Baltimore police officers do not live in Baltimore City. 80 to 90% of, what does that mean when your police force does not live in your city at that higher rate? 9.5% of our police officers, according to the Able Foundation report issued in 2012, said that 9.5% of our officers commute from Pennsylvania and Delaware. What kind of relationship are you going to have with the people in Sandtown, Winchester, in Middle East, in these disinvested red line black communities, when you haven't grown up, when you don't have the exposure? And I'm not talking about one or two black people, I'm talking about to a whole community. So segregation helped harden stereotypes and racial bias, which leads to more police brutality, excessive use of force. And so these are the impacts, and today the damage continues. Baltimore is hyper-segregated. According to sociologist Douglas Massey and his colleague Jonathan Tanman, it's one of the top 8 hyper-segregated metro areas in the United States today. This is a racial dot map from Dustin Cable at the University of Virginia. Look at the residential pattern here. Green is black. This is today. There's a corridor in the middle. It's like a L. Whites, Asians. There's a Hispanic community here. But look at how segregated we still are today. Today, zooming in. Deeply, deeply segregated. If we look at our financial institutions today, look at how traditional banks, best interest rates, best loan practices, are clustered in that L disproportionately. compared to payday lending facilities, check cashing places, how they're disproportionately in the areas where people don't have the same amount of income. How we allow redlining, or perhaps in this instance, reverse redlining, because now disproportionately redlined Black communities are being targeted by predatory lending practices. This was an article in the New York Times, Racial Penalties in Baltimore Mortgages, and it talks about a study where they found that in Baltimore, Black borrowers over the 30-year life of a loan paid almost $15,000 more for their home today, between 2000 and 2008. From 3,000, they looked at 3,000 Wells Fargo mortgages, and they controlled statistically for down payments, credit scores, and a whole host and plethora of factors. So when we talk about segregation, we're not just talking about segregation and the hyper-segregation that exists today. We're talking about housing market discrimination, and it is still with us. What could we do? What could people do with $15,000? Invest it in a child's college fund, use it to improve their health insurance. You know, health insurance is very expensive, right? So these are lost opportunities because of housing market discrimination. So how do we make Baltimore whole? We have to dismantle this hyper-segregation. We have to tear segregation apart. We have to integrate our neighborhoods. We should support a plan for Baltimore reconstruction and reparations, starting with Hopkins Local. Anybody ever heard of Hopkins Local? Wait a minute, now come on, y'all go here. Y'all, have you heard of Hopkins Local?
Yes.
All right, are you excited about it? Does it sound good? You want to be? Does it sound good? Sounds better? All right, because the plan is invest more locally in contractors, to invest more in minority-owned and women-owned businesses, and to hire more people locally. That's the plan, right? Except I showed you earlier what Hopkins has already done. Right? When you add up 742 Black families, 855 Black families, that's 1,500 Black families that have been displaced. And let me tell you, Black families back in the 50s and 60s, they were not small families. At least 4 people, probably 5 on average, and maybe a few more in some instances. So we're talking thousands and thousands of people. What is Hopkins doing to make restitutions, to make reparations for the damage that is done in these communities, with these families? Right? These are the types of questions that we should be asking. Not how can you solve and help with employment in the future, but what about Henrietta Lacks? Has the college made reparations and restitution for that sister? They stole her cancer cells, making billions off of her everlasting cells that still live today in research labs. And the family has not been paid 1 cent. Not 1 cent. So it's one thing to talk about, let's hire some new people, let's get a few more contracts, let's do more minority and women businesses. But what about making the community whole in the way that it's already been damaged? That's where this institution needs to start. That's where this institution needs to start. We need democratically run community benefits districts to help with community-controlled investments. And I'm thinking about worker co-ops, housing co-ops. I'm thinking about solidarity economy to be used to help communities to regain wealth. And there's an election next year. We can make it very practical, and we can stop it from being hypothetical by electing a mayor who will commit to changing Baltimore's spending priorities. And this is Baltimore's spending priorities. We spend more on policing than we do on health, parks and recreation, housing, community development, and arts and culture combined. And that number is higher now. So almost $500 million on our policing. And then in the school system, Baltimore City Public Schools, they also have a school police force And we spend more on that than we do on language, literature, and culture, STEM, media, and institutional or instructional technology, and career readiness combined. These are our priorities in Baltimore City. With allocations like these, we basically have a police state. We basically have created and perpetuated apartheid today. Not in the past, not 105 years ago, but right now. And until we change that, all of our nursing, medical, public health activities, if we don't go to the root, the social determinants of health, right, we're just scratching the surface. We're just dealing with the tip of the iceberg. We're not getting at the root causes. These are the root causes. You cannot heal a city by continuing to police people to death with rough rides, with preventing them from getting medical care, with brutality. You cannot police your way out of a dysfunctional apartheid situation. You can't do it. All we're doing is keeping ourselves in business. Right? We're keeping the nonprofit industrial complex, the academic industrial complex, we're keeping it alive. I'm gonna have a good job. I can keep talking about this for 50 years if we don't do nothing. Yeah. And we'll be talking about it in 50 years. We'll have another uprising in 50 years too. We will, because apartheid policies create social pathologies. Apartheid policies, y'all can quote me on that, by the way. Apartheid, quote Lawrence Brown, apartheid policies create social pathologies, right? All those policies led to a massive riot in '68. The one we saw earlier this year, really a shadow of that. Well, these are my citations, but I just want to end by saying this. We've been hearing a lot about how Black lives matter. I encourage you to think deeper than that. It's not just Black lives matter, it's also Black neighborhoods matter as well. Thank you.